Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another A Little Harmless Fun. We've been having so much fun with this series, and we're so grateful to our friend Frank Rizzo for putting it together for us. And so grateful, too, to all of you for being in the audience tonight and in our past sessions. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum. And a year ago, I was running author talks and programs live and in person in our auditorium. And now we're doing it and pretending we're in our auditorium right over at the Twain House. So let's all kind of imagine that we're in Mark Twain's house and chatting with tonight Frank Rizzo and our new friend, Joyce Maynard, who we're thrilled to have here. One of the things that we say about the Mark Twain House is that it's a writer's home and a home for writers, and we're always really happy to welcome a new writer into our fold. So welcome to Joyce. Before we move on to the program that I know you're all anxious to get started, I just want to mention a few things. First of all, this is the next to the last of the Little Harmless Funs for this season. The next one and final one of the season is going to be on December 8th. It's going to be a very, very special program. We're going to be commemorating John Lennon. December 8th is the 40th anniversary, believe it or not, of his death. And Frank, as a young reporter for the New Haven Register, was covering the vigil at the Dakota. And he's going to share with us a bunch of wonderful unpublished up till now photographs, and he's going to be joined by Beatles expert Charles Rosenay and Roger Catlin and Steve Metcalf, who were music critics for the Hartford Courant. So it's going to be a wonderful evening, and we invite all of you to come back for that and be prepared to share your thoughts and your remembrances of that incredibly life-changing experience that happened 40 years ago. So a few things about Crowdcast. I see you're all already availing yourselves of the chat, and I love seeing that. And please keep doing that throughout the program. That makes it more fun, makes it feel more like we are all together and enjoying this experience as a group. But we're going to have a Q&A for Frank and Joyce at the end of our program tonight. So if you actually have a question that you'd like one of them to address, rather than put it in the chat, it's a big help to us if you can put it down there at the bottom of the screen where you see the words "Ask a Question." And you can go in there and put your own question. If you see that somebody else has already asked the question that you want to have answered, you can upvote it. And so we look forward to hearing your questions and getting the answers from Frank and Joyce. Another aspect of the screen that I want to share with you is that green button right beneath our faces that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Truer words were never spoke. This has been, as for so many organizations, a really trying time for the Mark Twain House and Museum. We've done, I think, an incredible job of keeping the doors open and keeping these programs available, as many as 2 a week, actually, for the past many months. So we're very pleased to be able to do that. But even though tonight's program is free to you all, it is not free for us to put on. And we are a private nonprofit organization. We do not receive state or federal funding for the most part. We depend on revenue from programs and from our house tours. So if you are able, and I know not all of us are, but if you are able and so inclined, if you would share a little bit with us or a lot bit with us by clicking that donate button, just know that it is deeply appreciated by the staff and the Board of Trustees at the Mark Twain House and Museum. So thank you for that. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Frank Rizzo. He is a theater critic for Variety. He's covered the Connecticut arts and entertainment scene for more than 40 years. So he started when he was 3. 33 of those years for the Hartford Courant. He also writes for the New York Times, American Theater Magazine, Connecticut Magazine, the Hearst Newspapers of Connecticut, and many more publications and outlets. He's vice chair of the American Theater Critics Association, and his website is showriz.com, and you can follow him at showriz at Twitter. and I will put those addresses in the chat for you. So I will see you all at the end when we do the questions and the answers. And please join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House welcome to Frank Rizzo and Joyce Maynard.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening and welcome to another session of A Little Harmless Fun. Tonight, I'm especially thrilled to welcome Joyce Maynard, an author, journalist, syndicated columnist, and for the past year or so, a neighbor here in Connecticut, where she's returning to Yale after more than 45 years. But we'll get to that soon enough. Joyce is the author of 17 books, including her novels To Die For, which was made into a Gus Van Sant film starring Nicole Kidman, and with a screenplay by the late great Buck Henry, and the novel Labor Day, which was made into a Jason Reitman film starring Kate Winslet and Josh Brolin. Her riveting and provocative memoir, At Home in the World, was also a bestseller, and her last book, The Best of Us, is a moving chronicle of love, loss, and living. When the pandemic began to shut down the world in March, Joyce was about to present her annual writing workshop in Guatemala on Lake Atitlan. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Joyce. Oh, close enough. And instead of rushing home when the US and other countries were shutting down as COVID cases spiked, she decided to stay there on a stunning mammoth lake in sight of 3 volcanoes, where she remained through the summer. It was a productive time when she finished one book, starting another, as well as undertake renovations on her Central American retreat. A native of New Hampshire, Joyce began publishing her stories in magazines when she was 13. I thought I was young when I started at 16. She first came to wide national attention with her New York Times Magazine cover story in 1973, when she was 18 and a freshman on scholarship at Yale, which had just opened up its enrollment to women a few years earlier. Her article, An 18-Year-Old Looks Back at Life, attracted the attention of author J.D. Salinger, and so began another remarkable, in this case, devastating life experience. But Joyce's life is filled with experience and writing and learning and resilience. Now, decades later, she's back in New Haven, and I'm so pleased to be able to join us here at the virtual Mark Twain House and Museum. Welcome, Joyce.
So good to be talking with you, Frank. I could actually stick my head out the window and call that greeting. Frank and I are friends and neighbors in Worcester Square in New Haven. And I
think most of us will remember where we were when we began sequestering in March, but few will remember where other people were. And my husband, Bill, and I thought often of you in Guatemala and took great delight in following you on your Facebook page. Joyce, by the way, writes a hell of a good Facebook page. So Joyce, can you take us through that period while you were there and what the day-to-day drama was at the beginning of that pandemic? It must have been mind-boggling.
It was actually, and I felt very lucky. For the last 20 years, Frank, I have hosted a week-long writing workshop, memoir workshop, on the shores of Lake Atitlan. It's my labor of love. I actually learned how important it was to help other women tell their stories because I had one that I did not tell for so long. And that's the story I told in At Home in the World. And after my experience publishing that book, I made a sort of promise to myself that I would assist other writers at whatever level of expertise, including really just starting out, to tell the stories that they were having, that they were haunted by. And so I teach workshops here in my home in New Haven and now online. But once a year, I went down to Guatemala and invited applicants from all over the country and beyond to come and join me. When I say the country, I mean the United States and Canada. So as it happened, the workshop was beginning just when the world was changing. And my 18 women flew down. There was at that point not a single case of COVID reported, although we certainly knew that things were getting very difficult in our country. But I knew that there were people coming who had planned for this for a few years. It's always the way. It's a very special experience to a lot of people. And so I wanted to be there for them. And there were all 18 made it as far as Guatemala City. And that night, the president of Guatemala announced that the airport was closing in 2 days and that people who wanted to get out of the country had better get out. And eight of the women left, but the others stayed. That was the amazing part. My chef had to leave, and that was a challenge because
it sounds like a reality show.
It really sort of was. And they didn't know. In many cases, these were women who had never been to Central America, sometimes never traveled alone before. So I had a huge responsibility, and I knew that we needed to sequester at my house. My house happens to be a very beautiful place. So we spent. It's always an extraordinary week, but this one more than ever. They didn't really know how they were getting home, but I had a faith that they would be able to. And in fact, the group, they stayed longer than they normally would, but the U.S. Embassy had a flight for them and they left a couple days later. I mean, later than the end of the week. But two of them didn't have any particular need to go home. They were young women that I'd never met before. But I felt that they should stay. And so I invited them to stay on in my home. And as it turned out, we were there for 6 months. They were half my age, both 32 years old. And we created this extraordinary little trio of the three of us. We worked very hard during the day. One was a musician. One was a lecturer from Harvard on immigration issues. And we did our own things during the day and then gathered every night. We taught one of them how to swim, who didn't know how to swim. And every night we put on fancy outfits and lit the candles and made a great meal and sat out on my deck under the stars and talked.
Well, that sounds fabulous. We were in a fetal position in Worcester Square.
I will say that although there was no COVID in my village, it's a very small Mayan, very beautiful, extraordinarily beautiful place. But it's a very small village where people earn their living in farming and building and working for the tourist industry. And of course, the tourist industry shut down. So there was just a devastating effect on the town. And I decided to do something that I could never afford to do in this country, but I undertook these renovations on my house just to employ a lot of people. And this will sound crazy, but I had 30 men coming over to my house every morning at 6:30 a.m. to work. And they're working with hand tools, and they're carrying, stone and cement and sand and tools. And they worked there for 3 months and the place was beautiful to begin with, but it's even more beautiful now.
But you did some work too. You were writing. I saw pictures, and it almost looks like a literary Bali High.
Well, the thing was, Frank, seeing all those men coming in and knowing that I'm the payroll was very inspiring. So they came down to do the really heavy lifting. One of the projects, I put a new roof on my house. I built a new little casita. Finally, I built a waterfall, and they were carrying in boulders, to build this waterfall. And I was going up to my little tree house to write. And it was so inspiring because I knew that I'd better work really hard. And I did. I finished a book. I finished one book and started another.
Your Guatemala retreat is designed to be, of course, a writing workshop, and especially a memoir writing workshop, and even more specifically, for women writers. So why just women, and what is there about being together without the guys around?
Well, I'll tell you, I really like men, and I want to work with men. And it used to be open to both men and women. And you might not be too surprised to know that the vast majority of people who came always were women. But there'd be a couple of men who'd sign up. You know, one year there'd be 2, another year they'd be 3. And they were always really good men. Any man who is going to sign up for a memoir workshop with a group of women is a certain kind of man. We loved the men. They were terrific. But then one year there were no men, and the women were different. And the women talked about things that they hadn't before. And I don't fault the men for this, but I think women in our culture, at least women of my generation, have been so accustomed to adapting to the men and making sure that things are caretaking, a lot of caretaking. Okay. And suddenly they didn't have to do that. And the dam just burst. And it was another whole level of authenticity from the women. And I decided I'll teach men in other places. Here in New Haven, I teach whoever signs up for my small workshops in my little apartment here on Worcester Square. But in Guatemala, it's just women.
Memoir writing is such a tricky genre and tricky craft. So what makes a great memoirist? I always like to work at least one Mark Twain quote into these talks. So here it is. It's about the craft of writing. And the quote is, "The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug."
Ooh.
Yes.
I'm going to say, I might ask you to send me that one.
So
that's a huge question. And it's a really important question. I will say that I was raised in a family that revered language and revered books. My mother was the daughter of Russian immigrant Jews who came to Canada with absolutely nothing and really scraped to get herself a full scholarship to college, which was the only way she was going to get there, and eventually made it to Harvard, Radcliffe, got herself a PhD, and as a wife and mother of the 1950s, could not get a job. That was her story. My father, another sort of story of, artistic frustration. He was a painter, a very good painter whose work was not seen. And I was their student. My sister and I both were instructed by them from a very young age in a way that I did not replicate with my own children, heaven forbid. But there was no way not to have a real respect and reverence for language. So there's that piece that I take very seriously, which is the craft. And I'm not one to just say, spill your guts on the page and don't worry about how you say it. I do worry about how you say it, and I believe every writer should. But at the same time, it doesn't matter how elegant the craft is if there isn't honesty and authenticity. And that's probably the central theme of the workshops that I teach. That comes very much out of the fact that when I published my book At Home in the World, the story that I didn't feel able to tell for many years of what happened with Salinger, there I am at age 19. I was told, the critics almost, you were around then, you may remember, almost every single review was an absolutely devastating criticism, not even of the book, but of me for telling that story. I should have kept my mouth shut. So I teach memoir as a way of, nobody should have to be given permission, but of reminding people that there's one thing nobody should ever take away from you, and that's your own story.
So to go beyond the couch or the confessional, when you read a memoir that just hits you, it's strange because you read some and they're okay, and then you read something that is very special, and it's transcendental. You suddenly are taking that journey with that person, and even though it could be something that's so a profession or a life so unlike yours, there's something, and I think you're talking about the truth of the matter, and touching on those universal connections of just being a human. And you are alongside that writer's journey.
Yes.
That's something.
I'll just say yes. I think there's something about the truth that is just unmistakable. And it's very brave to tell the truth. And of course, if you do tell the truth, you're not going to come off heroic, because few of us are. Nobody I know. But, you know, I grew up in an alcoholic family. I adored my father, but my father got drunk every night, and every morning we pretended it never happened. And I learned a lesson very early about not talking about difficult things. We talked about art and music and literature and religion and politics and even sex, but not what happened in our own house. And it wasn't even my shame, but I felt shame for my family, you know? And I also felt incredibly alone. I thought I was the only person in the world with a parent who got drunk. I didn't know it was a thing that happened. And that was such an isolating, such a lonely thing.
So did writing help you deal with it?
At first, I wrote skillfully, but not honestly. My early writing, I published a book when I was 19 called Looking Back, that in the 160 pages of that book, which was written in the house of J.D. Salinger, I never mentioned that I dropped out of my Ivy League college to move in with a 53-year-old man. I never mentioned that I grew up in an alcoholic family. I didn't tell the truth. And I made it a sort of smoother story, but a less authentic one because of it. What I learned, not all at once, but gradually, was that every time I trusted the reader with the truth, I was rewarded with the reader's trust in me. And I'm now, the word that was used again and again about At Home in the World was shameless, as if that's a bad thing to be. And I wear it proudly. Yeah, I am fairly shameless.
So you have a home in California. You have 3 grown children now, and you have a successful career as a writer.
I haven't been home in 2.5 years, almost 3 years. I rented out my house, came to college.
And then you decided to, come to Yale. I know the backstory here, but it's such a good one. And it begins with this beautiful book by this beautiful young writer that you read. You tell it much better than I could. Well, take us on that journey back to Yale.
First of all, I'll just say, Frank, that I never expected to go back to college. I dropped out when I was 18, and then I was embarked on my own writing life, and then a marriage, and raising of children, supporting a family. I was a single parent for many years. I was putting my own kids through college. There was no thought that I was going to go back to college. When I was in my 50s, I made a very good second marriage. I'd been on my own for 24 years. I had a whole new life with my husband, Jim. 2.5 years into my marriage to Jim, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he died 19 months later. And suddenly, everything that I thought I knew about my future was no longer true. Meanwhile, I had been living in California. I'd moved on with writing many other books, novels mostly. But there was a sadness always that my book At Home in the World had been such a sort of condemned, almost banned book. You wouldn't find it in a bookstore. The Washington Post called it the worst book ever published. Maureen Dowd called me a predator for writing it, Then I learned, I'm always interested in young writers. And I learned about a young writer named Marina Keegan, who had attended Yale, clearly a brilliant young writer, who was tragically killed in a car accident very soon after her graduation from Yale.
This is in 2012, right after she graduated. 5 days. She was about to start her career at the New Yorker.
Yes.
And she just graduated magna cum laude.
And I bought a book of her essays. I just had read about her, and I wanted to know who she was. And there was the preface to the book was written by a writer that I deeply admired, Anne Fadiman. I didn't even know that Anne was teaching at Yale, but it turned out that Anne was Marina Keegan's teacher. And in her preface, she said that among the books that she taught in her class on memoir was mine, At Home in the World. And that when she taught this book, this is a few years back now, not so many years back, almost every student in that class espoused the view of people like the critic at the Washington Post that I had no business writing about this great writer, and that I should not have written that book. But one person in the class was my champion, and that was Marina Keegan. Wow. And I wrote to Anne Fadiman, who I'd never met, though we're exactly the same age. I said, if you'd ever like me to come to Yale, no thought of being a student, just, I said, I would come and visit your class. I'd love to talk to those kids who think that a writer should not be allowed to tell her story. I think that's an important question to look at. So Anne invited me. And her first words when I walked into the classroom, this was some months later, were, "You have unfinished business at Yale." Hmm. And she said this to me for the next 3 years of visits. Actually, when she
would come back to visit.
The first time I came, my husband Jim was still alive. And then the year that he died, I thought again about that long time invitation that Anne made. She said, "Come back to Yale." And I applied. And it wasn't an automatic that I was going to get in. They wanted my SAT scores from 1970.
So had you been thinking about ever returning to any college, or did you do a what if over the years? What if I stayed in school?
Oh, some of that. For sure. I don't think that, exploring the parallel universe of the life that you didn't lead is particularly helpful, but I certainly felt regret. I had barely been back to New Haven, but I had gone to a couple of reunions, and I just saw the people that would have been my friends, if I'd stayed.
What was that first year, the 1 year that you were there on scholarship, I might add? What was that like? Because it was only a couple of years into
the third
year admitted women at all to the university there. So that must have been strange times.
It was. And Yale hadn't really figured out how to do it entirely. Yeah, there were very few, they called us women, but hey, we were girls in so many ways. I was anyway. I was a very young 17-year-old when I hit New Haven. And I was overwhelmed and fearful, and felt that everybody else was smarter than me and more sophisticated than me and having, more fun than I was. And I was simultaneously being a student and also writing. I was still writing for 17 magazine. I had gone to my editors, actually. This was my freshman year at Yale. I was so shy. I couldn't talk to a boy. I could barely go to the dining hall. But I would go into New York and talk to my editor. You know the whole story. You sort of sit down and you give your ideas. And I said, I think I'd like to write a story about the Miss Teenage America pageant. And I was 17. I was secretly envious of all those girls who seemed to have it all figured out when I didn't. And my editor said to me, well, we'd only be interested in a story about the Miss Teenage America pageant from somebody who was a participant in the pageant, by which they certainly meant Miss Teenage New Hampshire. And I wasn't going to be that. But I still kind of amazes me that I could do this. I went back to my dormitory, and no cell phones, of course, and I looked up the number of the pageant offices in Fort Worth, Texas, and I kind of lowered my voice and I said, "This is Joyce Maynard calling from 17 Magazine. We'd like to do a story on your pageant, but you would need to make me a judge of the pageant." And they did.
Wow.
So I boarded a plane and I flew to Fort Worth. So I had these two different lives going on. I was being this college girl studying, medieval art and architecture and
getting bylines, in magazines and newspapers. What at that time, how did you envision after you left Yale? Were you going to be a reporter, an author, a playwright?
I was going to be a movie star. I wanted to act.
Well, it's not too late.
I really, that was my love, was painting and performing. And I was in lots of plays at Yale. And I loved theater. I wrote because it was a thing that I knew made my mother happy and that I knew how to do because I'd been trained to be a writer. It was, Frank, it was a few decades before I actually found joy in writing. I do now. I love it. I feel so lucky. I had an experience this morning that I knew I wanted to write about it, and I came racing home from my experience and just wrote, and that was to me like a joy to tell a story. But I didn't feel that. It felt like a heavy obligation when I was young. But I took that Miss Teenage America story, which I was very disappointed that the magazine had run it in an altered form and had taken away all my sort of new journalism, wise ass kind of stuff.
I hear you.
They published it in a very kind of bland fashion. And I took the original version and I, again, chutzpah is the word, I mailed it off to the editor-in-chief of the New York Times and said, I think I should write for you. And interestingly, I always tell this story to kids because I think it's worth knowing, there's nothing wrong with asking. And so here I am.
Absolutely.
A week later, I got a letter back giving me the assignment to write about the only thing I was equipped to write about, which was myself.
Were you prepared for the impact of that piece? And we're talking now of not just a column, but a huge, lengthy New York Times Sunday magazine cover story that really declared yourself as kind of not necessarily a spokesman for your generation, but certainly a person who is reflecting on your generation. Yeah. And actually, in a way, that's what Marina was doing at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I had no clue. I mean, in many ways, this was everything that my mother always wanted for me, to get out of my small town in New Hampshire and be acknowledged in the world in a way that she never had been. I always dreamed of New York City and the theater and the excitement of the museums and the theater. But when it happened, it was overwhelming. There were 2 days after that story ran. And it's worth remembering that in those days, there was no internet. There were 3 channels on TV. There were a handful of media that people looked at. And they therefore, I don't think there's any event that could happen now in some piece of media that would have that kind of immediate impact. But for me to be on the cover of the New York Times Magazine section in April of 1972. Yeah. So there was a huge sack of 1,000 letters at least delivered to my Yale room. And one of them was the Salinger letter.
Yeah. Before we get to that, can we talk a little bit about you physically returning to Yale not too long ago? When did you first arrive here?
The fall of 2018. Yeah.
And what was that like? Especially the first few days here.
Oh.
All
the worries. I mean, in some ways, I feel so lucky. It was education without all of the angst of worrying. I wasn't worried about my grades. I wasn't going to be worried about getting into graduate school. I wasn't worried about what all the other people thought of me. There was no way I was going to sort of fit in, in the normal kind of way. I was just going to be me. And I went really with one agenda, which was to learn. I wasn't taking writing classes. I was taking everything else that I hadn't gotten to do, And I felt very welcomed. It was intoxicatingly exciting. I looked at the course listings and I wanted to take 20 classes. I took way too many. I took 5.
So I shouldn't romanticize or to get this wasn't the trip to Bountiful here, or was it? Were you looking at?
I mean,
you're seeing your younger self here.
I had no illusion about, going back. I was not going to, relive my late teens and 20s.
No
I was
mixers.
me at age, I guess I was 64 then. I was going to do it in a way that's sort of the purest way, for the education, And one of the things, some of the classes were thrilling, some disappointed me. They were not all Anne Fadiman. I have sometimes been frustrated by the degree to which, it's an odd thing to say for somebody to say who was herself, who had an experience, a very hard experience of what I'll call, the imbalance of power of a much older person to a younger person, and sexual harassment is not the word in my case, but we are now, the Yale of now has corrected so many of the failures of the Yale of 1971, but also not without some cost. I mean, I'm so glad that, we get to read the African-American writers who were just not on any syllabus before. My best friend was a gay man who could never have said that he was a gay man, in that 1971 world. So good on Yale, and good on our culture that we've come far.
So how did you find the students, beyond the differences of age, how were the students now, and we're not even talking about millennials now, we're talking about Generation Z kids. How did they compare to the students that you were?
Well, first of all, I would never generalize about them anymore. I think that was a big flaw of my 1972 self, making grand pronouncements, about my generation. So there are many different ways. I really know a lot of students. I'm not their mother. I could practically be their grandmother, but they come over to my house. I now just like one-on-one in my garden, but I have this rare access to young people. They're brilliant. They're extraordinarily disciplined and hardworking. They wouldn't have gotten into Yale if they weren't. They haven't necessarily had the life lessons. I think COVID has been a huge challenge for many of them because they know exactly what to do in the classroom. But when you don't have the structure of the classroom, a lot of them have been really in school, for 12, 15 years. So I feel very, very tenderly and sort of protective about many of them. At the beginning of each semester, I've ordered a box of At Home in the World, and I give them to students, men and women, throughout the year. I choose people that I feel like, oh, that story could help them, because it really is a story about a young person's finding her voice.
So do you think attitudes of that writing class, that actually you went to Anne's writing class over the number of years,
I was just there.
Has the attitudes changed to your book and what you were saying? Because now we're in a Me Too movement, and an important movement, and a good movement. And if your book came out now, what difference would that make?
Oh, huge. Absolutely huge. And I'm so glad that young people now are shocked by the response from years ago. I think it's baffling to them. I'm sitting, well, I used to be sitting, now I'm in a Zoom, with a class that begins by everybody saying their pronouns, and there's a level of sort of respect for people's identity and their choices that did not begin to take place in the Yale of long ago that I knew. That said, I think it's a very I don't at all envy the young people for being young people today. I think it's really a hard moment and a lonely one.
For those who might not be familiar with the book, your memoir, or the backstory, there was one correspondence that you received among the fan mail that you got when the magazine article came out in 1972. And that was from the reclusive author J.D. Salinger, author of Catcher in the Rye, Franny and Zooey, 9 Stories. He was 53 and 35 years your senior. He corresponded with you for a time, and a relationship developed. And eventually you finished your freshman year, gave up your scholarship, and started your relationship with him at that time.
Yeah.
It was a relationship that only lasted a year, but in the end, it was devastating.
Well, yeah, I mean, here I am 50 years later, he's still a part of my story. He's not the big part of my story to me, but my identity is so much that, the last novel that I published a couple of years ago, the review, there's only one book of all my books that mentioned Salinger, but the first paragraph of the review was the reviewer talking about Salinger. So it dogs me.
And it's just one part of your book.
And because it's absolutely, it's not, people will sometimes say you wrote the book about Salinger, and I'll say, no, actually, I wrote a book about me and Salinger.
And it's your story. You have a right to your story as well.
But I do claim that story. I don't shy away from it. Sometimes people will say, oh, I hope you don't mind my bringing it up, because I also think it's an important story for me to tell, that this happened, and it had 2 things happened. One, that I gave up my voice and gave up my education and gave up so much for a powerful man. And 25 years later, when I claimed that story and told it, I was pretty devastatingly shot down again. And that could have been a moment when I would have just said, I give up. But actually, I think it made me much stronger being that way.
Did you feel things starting to turn around as the 2000s happened, and when younger people were reading your book, if they could find it, or Anne was teaching it in the class, and especially women, did they get it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yes. Especially the young.
It is a very rare woman who hasn't had some form of that experience, I think. And it's on the one hand, it's a very particular, odd story. This girl who's, in the New York Times, and Salinger writes to her. And in another, it was a rather universal story. It's about, I was a very good girl. I was a girl who really wanted to please my parents, please Yale, please 17 Magazine, please Salinger. I became a really bad girl in the eyes of some. I did something I wasn't supposed to do, which was I told the truth. And women have been punished for that, as we both know, over time. One of the first experiences I had when I came back to Yale, and it's the only time I've cut class, was to watch the Kavanaugh hearings. And for me, those hearings were indescribably painful. I felt I was seeing a woman telling the truth, and I was seeing a woman who was paying a big price for telling the truth about a powerful man. And I remember that day sort of getting on my bicycle, and I still ride a bicycle all around New Haven, as I did all those years ago, and getting on my bicycle and feeling this just wave of sorrow, not even for my own girlhood self, but for all the girls, all those. And it's sometimes boys too. It's young people who haven't had a chance to claim who they are, and somebody claims them. And boy, I think it's important to hear those stories and to know that you can survive telling them.
Mm-hmm. And it must be great vindication too, is when you have a person like Ann Fadiman teaching memoir writing, nonfiction writing, and using your book as a model of not only writing but truth telling, and having a woman like Marina be inspired by it. The kind of the parallels between you and her, because she had her essay published in the op-ed page, The Opposite of Loneliness, I think the title was. And people immediately knew that she was someone special, and was a bright light for a young female writer. And so, do you have a sense of serendipity, or maybe synchronicity? Is there something in the air that makes this experience for you in New Haven and at Yale just feel so right?
You know, for a lot of years, I was always the youngest. I was the young person. I was the youngest in my family. I was the, youngest at, at the New York Times. I was certainly the youngest, person with Salinger. And I was sort of precocious. And I'm now the oldest. I'm the oldest in most rooms I go into. And that's okay with me. I actually love getting to be a mentor. I didn't really have a mentor. Salinger, I thought he was going to be my mentor, but he had a different idea of who he was going to be. I very naively wrote back to him thinking, oh, my spiritual guide, my teacher, my friend. I like being a mentor. And as much as anything I'm learning in the classroom at this school, it's that. COVID has been a challenge because online education doesn't really, here we are online, but I wanted to know those kids. I wanted to have lunch with them and get coffee with them. And I've been doing that. And for a while I thought, oh, that's going to be all gone. But actually, I'm lucky that I have a little outdoor space, and so far the weather has been warm enough that I can see people, and I do see people. It's really important.
What do young people think of Salinger? Do they read him? Can they make that separation, or should we?
No, I am happy to say we don't discuss Salinger.
And
I haven't asked. I really don't know. One of the things that people said to me after At Home in the World was published is they said, well, what did Salinger have to say about that? And the best news was I no longer cared. I had cared so desperately what he thought of everything and knew that I fell short. I was, not who I was supposed to be. I did not care. So no, I haven't asked them about it, about Catcher in the Rye.
And then you do have your own projects in front of you. You have 2 books. So tell me about the one that you finished at Guatemala and the new title for it, and when we can all buy it.
I'm very excited because this is my cover reveal, actually.
Oh,
I haven't, and there was I have a Facebook community that I really love of people, readers who most of whom I know. It's 5,000 people, but I can go through that list and be able to tell you something about most of them. And I asked them about various titles, and I couldn't get the title right, and I went through lots of titles. So the name of the book, the new novel that comes out May 25th next year, is Count the Ways. Oh, it's going to be back. Anyway,
this reveal. Get your screenshots here.
Yeah. And it's the story of a marriage and a divorce and the children of that divorce. And I think it's my best book that I've written. It's my biggest book. It's about 450 pages. It spans 40 years, and it pretty much is the 40 years that constituted my own time from being a young woman, making a marriage, making a family, all the sort of hopes of that didn't materialize, the death of a marriage. And it's interesting that you were talking about John Lennon. The book is set against the backdrop of a lot of the things that happened in that period. So I think the Watergate hearings are going on when she's first sort of entering into the scene, and the Challenger crash is experienced by the woman's children when they go off, so hopefully to school to watch this. John Lennon's death is in that book. So it's a book that spans the years 1973 to the 2000s.
My kind of book.
I loved writing this book. I loved the characters and I hated to see them go. But the new book
when can we buy the book? It's not coming out for a while.
May 25th. And of course,
May 25th,
pre-ordered. But
and
that
the book?
Count of the Ways comes out next spring. And there's actually, I started another novel while I was in Guatemala, but the book that which I will continue to work on, but the book that I'm working on now that I'm really excited, I'm going back to nonfiction, and it's a book about my experience going back to Yale. And it's part memoir, but I'm also having lots of conversations with people here about what college means now and what their college experience.
Well, the time that you're here, that is incredible, because you're here at this moment when you've experienced the in-person life of an undergrad, because you are an undergrad. And then suddenly we're thrust into this virtual reality. So it's a moment of time that I can't wait to get your thoughts and read that book. Does it have a title?
It doesn't yet. I'm open to suggestions. Yeah.
Okay, so our visitors can suggest titles on the side. So before we throw you, I throw you back to we throw ourselves back to Jennifer. A brief word about pie making. It's an important part of your book, Labor Day, I think, and of course the movie had that great scene.
Very briefly, the story goes like this. My mother was a fabulous pie maker. She never taught me how to make a pie, and I didn't think I'd ever have to learn because she was going to live forever. And she was a very healthy, sturdy woman, and she used to actually make a joke. She always was carrying a few extra pounds. She was beautiful, but she would say, "Oh, if I ever get a brain tumor, I'm not going to count calories." She got a brain tumor when she was exactly the age that I am now. And I had 3 little children and a struggling marriage. And I dropped everything and flew to Toronto to take care of her for the last summer of her life. It was clear it was going to be the last summer of her life. And her friends, she was a fabulous hostess and a really great cook, as I said. And she would, every night I made a pie for her friends to come and see her. And her friends would say to me 2 things. They would say, "Well, we're going to miss your mother." And then they would say, "We're going to miss her pie." And then they said, "Would you give us the recipe for her pie?" So, you're a good cook. Making great pie crust is not about the recipe. It's how you handle the dough. And the only way really to learn is to show somebody. So I started teaching my mother's friends how to make pie. And it was a very comforting thing for us all. And my mother died that fall, 31 years ago. And my marriage ended at the same time. My marriage really ended when my mother died. It was the fall of 1989. And I found that one of the most comforting things to do was to roll out that pie dough and just kind of, it was my act of meditation, And that Thanksgiving, I didn't have a family to go to. My father was dead and my children were going off with their father. And I threw open the doors of my house and said, "I'm going to teach anybody who wants to make a pie. And it became a tradition. We made so many pies that we had a parade of pies over to the soup kitchen in my town in Keene, New Hampshire. And when I moved to California, as I did some years later, I realized, who am I going to have over for pie? So I started doing pie to raise money for causes. And I would donate a pie lesson to something. And one time I donated a pie to an auction, and the high bidder, and boy, did he bid high, was Larry Ellison, Oracle software Larry Ellison, bid $2,000 for a pie lesson. And the next day, the gossip columnist from the San Francisco Chronicle called me up and she said, "When are you baking pie again?" And I had no intention to do it again, but suddenly I'm thinking, there's a man running for president. I thought he was bad then. That was nothing. But George Bush was running for president. And I said, "Well, I'm going to bake pie to defeat George Bush. And it'll cost $100 a person. And my phone was ringing off the hook." So that was about probably $50,000 worth of pies ago. I invite people to my home and teach them pie. And I think the Obama record was $10,000. This year, I couldn't invite anybody to my home, so I did a virtual pie lesson. So I don't need to ever eat pie again myself. It's a lot of pie, and
people can go to YouTube and actually get your clips to sort of take a virtual quick lesson.
They can. There's actually a better one than YouTube. Maybe if it's called curious.com. I have a 30-hour lesson. But, it's kind of about, I wanted to hold on to the tradition of something made with human hands that you can't buy in a store.
It's all about the human touch, and you have the human touch, Joyce, in your writing and in your pie making. And I think that's a good segue to get back to Jennifer to see if we have some input here. And,
I always love to hear from people who've got questions.
We do have questions, and they look like some really good ones. But before we move on, I just want to say, wow, what a great conversation. What a great evening. And I'm just so grateful to both of you.
It's such a pleasure talking to Frank.
He's okay. That Frank, he's all right.
Neighbor to have.
Before I move on to the questions, though, I would like to extract a pledge out of you, Joyce. You're in New Haven. We're in Hartford. We'd love to have you come talk about your new novel in May.
I love that. I would love that. And maybe by that time, I'll actually be able to see the Mark Twain house.
That would be awesome. Well, let's make that happen. So watch this space, viewers. So let's move on to the questions. Bobby Joe Buell wants to know, what are your favorite memoirs by other writers? Looking for a new reading list.
Oh, boy. I always get a little bit, I'll mention, I love The Story of a Face by, and I'm, for some reason, this always happens to me, I'm blanking on her last name, Lucy Greeley. Lucy Greeley, The Story of a Face is one that I should have a list, because this always happens to me. I go absolutely blank. Frank, why don't you help me out while I sort of...
Same here. Whenever anyone asks me what my favorite play is or the musical, I have like 10 and I just zone out. The one that was made into a play, actually, with Vanessa Redgrave.
Yes, I know what you're talking. Oh, Joan Didion.
Joan Didion, yes.
Of course.
Oh.
One just came into my head and out of my head. You know what? I'm going to do so badly on this question.
Well, what we can do is we can ask our viewers to put their favorites on this.
Embarrassing.
They can help us.
Autobiography of a Face. That's what it's called. Oh, The Story of a Marriage, Ann Patchett. I love that. It's actually very full of wisdom for writers. In fact, while we're talking about wisdom for writers, Stephen King's on being a writer. I have such a shelf. Of course, I lost contact with all my books when I came here, because all of my books are in California, where I once lived. I read so many essays because I teach, and so I teach the short essay. I love André Dubous's essays, From a Moving Chair, I think it's called. André Dubus the father, not André Dubus the third, who's a fabulous novelist and a friend. The Year of Magical Thinking, somebody's saying.
That's Joe Didion now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for your help, audience. And Joyce, if you remember any others, we can stick them in the chat later, because the chat lives on even when the program is over. So we can add to that later.
If people ever want to find me, a good way to find me is through my website, which is just my name. Or my Facebook page, where today I posted a quite in-depth story of, it was just my birthday, and I was given the most fabulous set of ice skates. And I briefly thought, I don't deserve these ice skates. These were really like serious ice skates. I love to skate, but I also thought I've just turned 67. But I had to have them formed to my foot. So I drove over to Cheshire today to have my foot put in a hot skate, and the skate sort of like molded around my foot. So anyway, today up on Facebook is my story of my skates.
Awesome.
There's really some story up there.
We look forward to reading. Thank you. A couple people want to know, how did you feel right after you wrote At Home in the World versus how you feel about it now?
You know, I'm happy to say I have no regret about that book. It cost me dear. It was at the time really devastating to my career life. It took a long time to sort of be able to be published again. I wasn't reviewed. I was really persona non grata. But it felt so good to tell the truth. And it actually, I'll tell you the other thing it did. It freed me to tell all the other stories that weren't memoir. I really became a novelist after I published that book.
Interesting.
It's interesting.
I sort of unblocked the pipes.
That's fascinating. Well, this is Patty Weiss-Levy wants to tell you. She says, Joyce, I read your book when it came out, and I was blown away and believed every word you had to say. One detail that has stuck with me for decades was frozen peas. Before reading it, I would have called Salinger my favorite author, and I guess Woody Allen remains my favorite filmmaker. How do we separate the artist from the art? It's a great question, Patty.
Patty. If you scroll a little bit further down on my Facebook page to what I published there, I think 2 days ago, I wrote about this subject because it comes up a lot for me. I had just written how much I admired Dave Chappelle's Saturday Night Live monologue last Saturday about the election. I thought it was just brilliant. And people complained and said, you know, he said terrible things about women, the Me Too movement, the Michael Jackson accusers. And this may all be true, and it does not. I think it's so important that we not cancel out the artist for the art, cancel out the art for the artist. I got it exactly backwards. I would never boycott Salinger. I mean, what are we going to do? Boycott Picasso? You know, there's the list of artists whose lives have not been lived in an exemplary fashion is long.
Well, also
read Woody Allen's
Twain and Huckleberry Finn.
Yes. Although Huckleberry Finn, I don't really think Huckleberry Finn is a racist book in any way. I
don't, but it often is accused of being that.
It is a book that has language that is particular to those characters. It was actually a moment. I will tell this story because we're at the Mark Twain house. That my first year back at Yale, there was a professor who was teaching a class in literature of the South. And Huckleberry Finn was among the books that were being read. And he evidently read a passage out loud that had that word. And the students, a huge number of students, protested and boycotted the class. I was not a student in that class, but had I been, I would not have boycotted that class. And I think it's so important that we make a distinction between what our characters say and what we believe. And that we not so curate this, you know, the world that we live in, that we don't allow intelligent people to make a distinction. So anyway, I was writing a lot about this the other day on Facebook, and there was a pretty lively discussion. And you might, Patty, if you're interested in this, I think you might enjoy scrolling down and seeing. I need to reread Huckleberry Finn. Me too.
Well, maybe we can have another discussion. That's obviously something that we at the Mark Twain House spend a lot of time thinking and talking and sharing information with other people about. It's very, very complicated and nuanced subject.
You know, I have never forgotten one of the first books that made a huge impact on me was Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. And many years later, I learned that her father, after her death, had excised certain portions of that in the name of, no doubt, you know, what I would call hugely ill-advised and inappropriate protection of her from, you know, the parts of the story that weren't nice. I'll never be an advocate for that. She didn't get to live her life as she should have. Her words should have endured as she meant them to be.
Right. Huh. So Wendy, moving to a different topic, and this comes up whenever we have wonderful authors here. Can you describe this is Wendy Maldonado.
Oh, Wendy. Hi, Wendy.
She asks, can you describe your creative process, and do you have a routine for writing?
Well, the biggest thing I'll say is that I'm an early riser. I believe in getting up early. But that's just me. I honor my body clock, which might not be somebody else's. Some people write in the middle of the night. But I love getting up very, very early in the morning and not checking my email when I'm really seriously working. And I go into a zone, and I play music that inspires me, and I light my candle, and I take a walk, and I might roll out pie crust. But most of all, I live with those characters. When I go to bed, the last thing in my brain before I disappear into sleep is what's going on in their lives. And the most wonderful gift often happens to me that in the night, I discover things. I almost always wake up with new ideas for them. And my brain has been working. That's been my sort of superpower, putting my brain to work at night. I'm a good
Wow, that's awesome. Excellent. A number of people have questions about the adaptations of your books into movies. I'm just going to kind of gather them together. And Patricia Howland's question, can you tell us what it was like having your books become movies?
Well, it was great, of course. I mean, it was particularly great because they're actually good movies, especially, I would say, To Die For. I think To Die For, if you haven't seen To Die For, it's a wonderful movie. And incidentally, there's an under-acknowledged performance in that movie, which is of Nicole Kidman's lawyer. And I've never felt that she really got her due. So you might watch for her.
And who played, what was the actress who played?
You do remember I said I wanted to be a movie star?
I know.
So it was great, of course. And, one of the things that that you have to do when a book is adapted for film is let it go, kind of like what you have to do with your children. Because it belongs now to the director and the screenwriter, and they have their own vision. And I didn't get too involved, although Buck Henry became a dear friend, and I talked to him throughout the process of To Die For. But Labor Day is set in the year 1987. It was actually shot in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, a beautiful little town. They turned the entire town of Shelburne Falls into 1987. So that was pretty thrilling. I went there partly to teach Josh Brolin how to make the pie, actually. That was my pie he was making, and I instructed him very well, I think. It was an onerous task. But the entire town looked like 1987. The cars, the clothes, the food in the grocery store. So yeah, that was a thrill. It also, I knew I gave a lot of people jobs. I like that too. Kind of like my in Guatemala.
Lovely of you.
I thought it was big of me too.
Marilyn Spielberg has asked, are you familiar with the book My Dark Vanessa? And if so, how does that compare with your story?
I've heard that title, but I don't know what it is, Marilyn. Can you remind us?
Marilyn, if you want to put something in the chat, we'll see if we can move forward with that. And while we wait for Marilyn, Julianne has been a very active chatter here tonight, and she would like to know, is your writing workshop open for applicants, or is it just by invitation?
Oh, no, it is. And if you go to my, thank you, Julianne. Is it Julianne? Julianne. I have been teaching more workshops in my home in the last year or so because people so need to be telling their story at the moment. So I do a very small socially distanced workshop. But now that the weather's getting cold and I can't be outdoors, I'm doing an online one in January. So if you go to my website, you can read about it. Yep. I don't think it's going to be Guatemala this year, and it kind of breaks my heart, but it will happen again. And when it does, there's no better week, in my opinion.
maybe you could set up your Zoom background to look like Guatemala, and we just pretend. It's a thought.
Not the same thing.
My house is full of Guatemalan things, but.
Ooh. So let's just take one more. And thank you, Victoria. Victoria's been posting links like crazy, and she's just posted a link to information about the workshop.
Thank you, Victoria. That's great.
Thank you. Appreciate your help.
And to my Pell post and to my ice skate post, I think. Yep,
that's up there too.
And if you want to
Angela Grout,
just go to page, I think it's 168 or 68 of Labor Day.
Okay, thank you for that.
You made it at Julia Child's kitchen too, didn't you?
I did. It didn't look quite as good as when Julia was in it, but I did make a pie in her kitchen.
So Angela Grout has asked a couple of questions about J.D. Salinger, and I'm going to encourage Angela to read the book. And I think all those questions will be answered. So there's a teaser for you. Thank you for, yes, At Home in the World.
And my Dark Vanessa is a Lolita-type story in which the novelist makes several references to Nabokov's novel.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, I don't know it either. Thank you for that. We'll look into it. And when Joyce comes back to the Mark Twain house, we can talk about it then. And as my the final question is, what do you like best about living in New Haven?
Well, I have to say, I'm loving Worcester Square where I live, where Frank also lives. There's no more beautiful place. But I'd have to say it's the kids. It's the students. I feel there are people from all over the world, and I can't think of a better thing to do, antidote to sort of, a lot of people at this age are sort of closing down and, narrowing horizons. I think it's so important to not do that, and there's no better way to offset that than to talk to young people and see what they're doing. So I'm very lucky that I get to do that. But
and you never joined a secret society either, or
I am a part of with Wendy Molden, Wendy who spoke earlier. I'm in the Elizabethan Club. Yeah.
But
I'm not in a secret society, no.
Awesome. So I just want to point out that we've mentioned and talked a lot about At Home in the World. There is a link in the chat where you can purchase a copy through our museum store. And why would you do that rather than just go to Amazon? Because your purchase supports the Mark Twain House and Museum. So we appreciate that very much. And talk about appreciate. I just have to say again to Frank and to Joyce, what a delightful, delightful evening this has been. Thank you for making it so and for sharing so much of yourselves and your story. And I'm serious about hoping you'll come back. And
absolutely. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Joyce. You were wonderful.
Absolutely.
I'll see you in the park.
Virtual applause. Everybody clap at home.
Great.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody. Thank you, audience, for being here.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you December 8th.